Okay, we're recording now, I think. Cool. Okay.
So since there are people joining, I just wanted to say that we'll give it a few minutes before we join, just waiting for a few more people to enter Zoom this evening. So thank you, please bear with us. So Nina and Woody, do you think we should give it to about 6:05 or should we just get going? I'm happy to pursue it however you think is fit.
Whatever you think is good for your audience. I'm happy to wait a few if you want, but we also don't want to put time tax on the folks that showed up on time. Whatever you think is better, we're happy.
Absolutely. Good point. Well, in that case, I think we would be happy to start the conversation this evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Gustafson. I'm assistant curator at the Norton Museum. And joining me this evening for this intimate conversation is Woody De Othello and Nina Johnson. And Nina Johnson's gallery currently has Woody's work on view in an exhibition called Coming to Light, which will be on view at their gallery, which is in Miami in the Little Haiti area until January 30th. And so we're really pleased to have this conversation this evening and be introduced to that exhibition. If you can't make it down there in person, this will be the next best thing. And if we can move on to the next slide here, Woody's work might be familiar to some of you who joined us last year at Art Basel Miami Beach. His work was on view upstairs in the Meridian section, so where the larger scale works were. And if you were on the tour with me, you would have remembered it because I pointed it out. I mentioned that Woody is a Miami native. He was born right here in sunny South Florida. And for me as a native Floridian as well, very connected in terms of the idea of a homecoming to this exhibition, and seeing his work on view at Art Basel was really great. So again, just a quick introduction in that manner to remind you, should you have seen his work last year. And I should just mention a few words about Nina and her gallery as well. I was introduced to the gallery a few years ago, and I was just so interested in the different the roster of artists that they showed. So it's really wonderful to have Nina and Woody here and be able to share their program, Nina's program with you, and of course, Woody's work. So with that, I'm gonna let Nina and Woody take it away. At the end, I'll be asking a few questions and you are welcome to do so as well, either in the chat or if you can manage, unmuting yourself and asking the question as well, whichever method you prefer. So again, Nina, Woody, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Norton for having us and for facilitating this amazing conversation. As Rachel mentioned, we are Woody's show is one of 3 exhibitions that are currently up at the gallery, and we're delighted to have him back for what we've been calling a homecoming, even though he's already back in Oakland. We couldn't keep him here too long. I've known Woody since he was just out of undergrad, and could not be more delighted. As another Florida native, we were joking before this conversation started that it was like all the homegrown oranges in one basket tonight. To just see where his career has gone, but more importantly, how sophisticated the work has gotten in the time since he's left, gotten his master's degree, and has started showing both with Jessica Silverman in San Francisco, as well as Karma Gallery in New York. This is Woody's first solo show with us, and the title of the exhibition is Coming to Light. I want to open up, I'm gonna kind of click through to an installation view to give you guys a little broader sense of the show. But I think what would be awesome, Woody, is if we start out with you telling us a little bit about the title and the impetus for this body of work, which I know changed from what you originally had thought this show would look like pre-pandemic to what it ended up being.
Yeah, I don't even remember what the show is gonna look like pre-pandemic. I feel like the first things that came about in making this show, and kind of like, I guess like the thesis or what really helped me to kind of like conceive of what the show might look like, were the paintings. So this painting here and the other one, Private Moments, I made in maybe July. And in these pieces, right, there's like a little ray of like light, or a little beam of a lighter area. So some of the figure was in what I was calling like, you know, just outside of the light. And just like looking at those things, I was just like, yeah, like it seemed like the paintings were at this like contentious moment. It felt like they're in this moment of like discovery, or like self-reflection and growth. And I thought that would be like a good kind of like prompt to like make work, and just like kind of like have the show be about like this this, not, I guess, like a reckoning. You know, I feel like, you know, this pandemic, we spent a lot of time just like at home, and really like confronting ourselves, not being able to kind of like distract ourselves from like the nuances of like an everyday routine. And I felt like you know, just, yeah, just like this year has been like an intense year of absorbing. So I feel like that's kind of like the main like genesis, or like the main kind of like thought process behind the works. And I feel like a lot of them have like this this moment of like self-reflection, or like contemplation, or they're kind of like confronting, there's like an individual figure confronting themselves in a particular way.
I want to talk about this one for a moment. No pun intended, private moment for a moment. But I want to talk about this one because of what you said with the ray of light. I think domesticity and the sort of domestic interior plays a really important role in your work, whether it's in the ceramics, and you've highlighted things like, you know, chairs and stools and shower heads, or whether it's in the painting where you do feel this Guston-like focus on how the figure interacts with the interior, particularly in these very like home generated environments. But I also feel that this ray of light, this kind of like very particular beam that's been a recurring theme in your work, serves as a way to kind of define the space that the characters that exist in your work take up, versus the space that like we as viewers, and maybe even you as a person versus you as an artist, take up. And I thought about it quite a lot with this particular painting, because the beam of light is also this sort of like, who's the guy in Charlie Brown with the gray cloud? It's sort of like this Linus-like downpour on this figure. And you said something really interesting to me when you were here, which was that you kind of channel, and I think you repeated this in the White Wall interview, you kind of channel a certain darkness or insecurities, things that you don't want to like take to heart in your everyday life, into the work so that it can live in that space. And I think in this particular work, that's so present. He almost becomes like the weeping Buddha sculpture, you know, like very kind of like classical figure. So tell us a little bit about, you know, about those ideas more broadly, and then also about like the particulars of the tangled figure that exists inside this painting.
Yeah, well, I feel like, you know, definitely like the work for me has like this cathartic like impact. I feel like, you know, it's a place for me to be like truly like vulnerable, you know, and like it's also a safe space for me to feel like I'm not being a burden by putting like these emotions or like having people like carry these emotions. So it's just like a nice tangible place for that stuff to exist. And then I think like last year I learned about this term Nikiski, which is like from like I read this book Flash of the Spirit, and it's about like, you know, Yoruba and old pre-colonial like African religion, but like Nikiski, like essentially I'm paraphrasing this definition. Nikiski is an object that's imbued with like spirituality and emotion, and a lot of times it serves like as a holder for whatever like social ailments or like negative like experiences like a tribe or a community of people might be experiencing, right? So I feel like I kind of like learning that, and like, you know, having this part of my like making for me that does serve this like cathartic like process. Like I feel like those two are like a nice place for them to merge together. And I feel like the home thing too is like that's like becoming more and more layered for me, because like I don't know, like so much of my work is kind of like situated in the idea of the domestic, or trying to like implement like a domestic feeling to it. And I feel like one, that's like thinking about the name of this piece, it's a private moment, right? It's a sacred space. It's a super like private space, and I feel like some like undertone like themes for me too are just like examining what home means for me. Like what is that exactly, right? And I feel like that's something I've been like thinking about a lot moving to Oakland. And like my blackness in Oakland is different than my blackness in Miami. So I feel like, you know, just like there's like always like this like shifting of like trying to make sense of what home is. You know, I feel like also like, you know, there's some of it like being first generation American too, just like, you know, I'm not Haitian, but I'm not like fully American. So it's just like I feel like a lot of that entanglement, a lot of that like kind of like contemplation, a lot of that like I don't know, like distortion in the figures, like trying to make sense of itself and its place.
I thought when you said that about this sort of like imposed identity, that I wanted to talk about that other piece, but I changed my mind. I want to talk about this one instead in relationship to that. This sculpture, and I've been saying this to people when they come in to see your show, all of these are a kind of self-portraiture. And I think that that's a very important concept for the viewer to keep in mind when they're looking at this work. I mean, for those of us that know you, like I feel particularly akin to this piece because I know you as a person first. And when I see the brown glasses on the figure, it's just like, you know, this is Woody, obviously, to me. But this sense that the sculpture with this particular work, it's like the hands of the sculptor are quite literally in the piece, and it's simultaneously forming but also collapsing itself. And I think that gesture is so wonderful, that like it is the weight on the form, which is also linked very formally to ceramics, right? It's kind of like the physics of the form is what allows it to exist and not collapse. And in this particular piece, it's both existing as a vessel and also like that weight pressing down on it. But I liked a lot when you were here, we had this really wonderful conversation about, you know, race in Miami, identity, you know, sort of racism, I guess, but talking about how in South Florida, racism is almost more cultural than it is aesthetic, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
if you're like Haitian or you're Dominican or whatever, it's very different. And then being transported to Oakland where you're Black, you know, and the sort of subtleties of those things, while in some ways it's a much more culturally sensitive place, a lot of this other nuance has been lost, and you're just being kind of saddled with an identity that's quite distinct from the one that you might feel as a first generation American and, you know, this as a Haitian, you know, the son of Haitian immigrants. I don't know, that's not
Yeah.
really a question, but.
Yeah, I feel like I don't even know how to make sense of it. I just know I feel different in my body in both spaces, you know, and I feel like it was more apparent like this previous trip, this most recent trip to Miami, where it's just like being aware of like the nuances is just like I just felt different in my skin. I felt more comfortable in Miami versus where like I don't know what it is about, like maybe it's like the kind of like political history here in Oakland. There's a lot of like, you know, like I don't know, there's just always a lot of dialogue about what's going on now and what's has happened historically, where it's just like I'm just aware of myself in a different way. And I feel like, yeah, this piece is like playing with kind of like I'm still not too sure if this piece is like giving itself comfort or if it's like weighing down on it on its own self, right? Because like when I was making it, I was like thinking of like this gesture, right, of like kind of like massaging your head or kind of trying to like cool down and kind of like relax, where this one is just like kind of a weird situation and it's literally pressing itself down. And yeah, the glasses are like a new thing too. Like I'm finding like subtle ways to kind of like put things that I'm like interested or like reading into the work. So like the glasses, like I was like thinking about like this dude, Edward Glissant, in a book Poetics of Relation. He talks about opacity and transparency. And I could go into like the specifics like of what those things mean, but like I was just really interested in that and and like an artistic like language, right? So I feel like that was also kind of like, you know, helping me to think about like, you know, the areas of light and incorporating like more shadows and like more opaqueness in the pieces as well. So yeah.
I love something that happens. I like the conversation about opacity, and to me, I think that relates really wonderfully both to this piece, um, self-imposed balancing act, as well as this piece in thought picking which one to mask. Because I think in this work, and of course, you know, I always say like sculpture, you have to see it in person, you know, more so, I mean, that's true of everything, but the subtleties in the glaze on this piece are so magnificent. And it sort of teeters between being so slick. And I wanted to show this close up because you can see some of that in that image, and being so dense, you know, like a
Hmm.
weighted object. But also it's funny. Like, I mean, also fundamentally, I think this is kind of, out of the sculptures in the show, the one that kind of has the brightest sense of humor, right? Like in thought picking which one to mask with his like hairpin on. You know, I mean, I think it's also a little bit of like self-deprecating and kind of um, finding a way to smile through what is like a grave self-examination and like cultural examination. Tell us about the pedestals, Woody, because some of these pieces in our show are, the tile pedestal is part of the work, and this is the first time that you've done this. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, the tiled pedestals, one, I was just trying to kind of like make the like give the sculptures more of a place, right? So I feel like a lot of times like, you know, there's like something kind of like nagging me in the studio where it's like I'd make this stool trying to kind of like create its own context and it just absorbs wherever it kind of like sits on top of, right? So I was like, one, I thought like, you know, a lot of times the sculptures ended up on like risers that were not my choosing, just like a typical like white like studio riser. And like that, the whole reason for me making the stools was to kind of avoid the riser situation or the pedestals situation. And then yeah, so I like thought to myself to like kind of like give it more of a place, give it more of its own world to exist. So I decided on these tiles, and like one, they reference like these childhood tiles I had at home. um yeah, my folks had to like rip out the carpet and replace our entire house when I was like younger with tile because I had like allergies. So we had like this dark tile growing up, and then two, like the color, um I was like reading something about this like Yoruba deity, Oshan, I believe is the deity's name, and it was like the goddess of water. and I was like referencing blue to kind of like reference that. And like the thing I love about like pre-colonial like religion, specifically like Yoruba's, is like there's always this acknowledgement of like, you know, both things existing in one like entity or deity, right? So like something could be good or bad. It's not fixed on either side. And I feel like the sculptures kind of like, at least I like to think of them existing in that place where you could feel like deeply and like compassionately for them and like have this sense of like empathy, but there are moments where it feels like a little bit lighter, where you're almost able to kind of like laugh at yourself, seeing the emotion like outside of yourself.
That's what I think is so brilliant about this one, is that like, I think this is the piece that most interacts with kind of a history of ceramics and formal sculpture, and the idea of a self-imposed balancing act as like, you know, the absurdity of this object being able to live in the world, right? That like, how can we talked also a little bit about the precarity of ceramic, you know, and that ceramic can be the thing that lasts the most, thousands of years, buried in the ground, you pull it up, it looks like it was made yesterday, but it can also in like one instant just be smashed to pieces to like not, you know, out of existence. And I think that is the balancing act, you know, kind of teetering amongst those things. So the plants are something that figures, you know, pretty frequently in your work as of late, both in the paintings and in the sculpture. This one that's in our show is titled Support for Growth. Tell us a little bit about how the plants figure in.
Yeah, I feel like the title for that is yeah, it's about growth, it's about care, it's about like, you know, paying attention. I feel like yeah, like just having plants in your space gives you this different awareness of how your body relates in the space. Like you're constantly like looking at light and like checking what the state of the plant is, right? And I feel like, I don't know, it's super like just like the type of care that goes into like, you know, keeping a plant alive, like feels very similar to like the type of care that goes into like making a sculpture. And it also feels like it goes into the type of care that like we just need to take over ourselves and like the people around us, right? So I love like the plants as like this analogy for like cultivating that space to kind of like bring attention to your environment. I feel like the sculptures are doing the same thing, where, you know, when you're interacting with the sculpture, you're not only aware of the sculpture, but you're aware of like everything else going and your body relating to the space. And I feel like, you know, there's something interesting about plants that does the same thing. It's just like you see something and like, I don't know, it becomes summer and now the area that like your fern was at is receiving too much light and then you have to move it. So I don't know. I feel like now and just like thinking and like rambling is just like, yeah, this connection with light kind of like makes sense to me too, with the plants and then with the glazes, how it fluctuates and changes in the different lights, you know.
And I think that also relates to this issue of precarity, right? To make a sculpture that's fundamentally comprised of something living that has to be replaced and sustained and cared for. I really love that gesture. And, you know, as somebody that's interested in design and architecture, I love the way it brings those elements into the conversation as well, which I think is a really important part of your practice.
Yeah, it kind of blur. I feel like I've been like, there's some things that kind of like, if you take them outside of the context of like me having a sculpture practice, like it like teeters on like this like idea of like design. And I feel like it's because I am referencing the domestic, so it makes sense that like that would become a little bit blurred.
It's function as concept, you know, like design is concept, the idea of a chair, not like specifically the chair. Um,
And Nina and Woody, we do have a first question coming into the queue from Ezra Hubbard, who's one of our Young Friends Acquisition Council members. So thank you, Ezra. And he's asking if, Woody, you could speak about your ceramic works. Do you see them as vessels? And then your choice to give them a high gloss that's almost wet or has a fluidity to it, why that choice is made.
So the vessels, I feel like a lot of them reference vessels, but I mean, I feel like they're like the vessels are my way of like having a figurative, like having a psychological, like emotional conversation without having so much of like the sculptures being like just straight up figurative ceramics, right? So I feel like use and then just like the language and like when you're thinking about a traditional vessel, like there's a neck, it has a foot, like there's a lot of the language that relates back to the body. Um, and the fact that it's just like a container and it's I guess it's implied that it can hold something. And then like the high gloss finishes, like I feel like I've been like kind of like stuck on that for the past couple of years. Before, like a lot of stuff was like matte and dry and like had a lot of surface to it. But like the main thing that I love about like the super like glossy finish is that you're able to see your own reflection in the works. I feel like that's something that I don't know. It's like one of those like I guess like concept driven things. If like the work is talking about this moment of contemplation and reflection and like looking within, like it's nice to be able to have that reinforced in the surface of the piece as well. So
that's a beautiful detail to show, to kind of illustrate exactly what you're saying here, Woody. And I just like to encourage people who are watching, feel free to submit questions as Ezra did, but I do have a few, if it's okay. I'm curious, Woody, I heard in another interview that you gave about the moment when you first touched clay. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that and the elective course that you took in undergrad that led you
yeah,
to pursue ceramics.
I feel like this is becoming a quote, like, cause I like, it's like, I always tell people like the second I touched clay, like I knew everything about my past and I knew everything about my future. And it's like the more and more time I spend with ceramics, the more and more it's like proving that true. I feel like I would not be out here like looking at like pre-colonial artifacts and like trying to look at like pre-colonial religions and like learn about like, all this like older stuff if I was not making ceramics. Like, I don't think that I would have came to that conclusion myself. And like, it's the thing that's like carrying, like literally pulling me forward, it's like the one constant, the one like stable thing is just like, that's just like always circulating in my mind. So it's like, it's like it's like a life relationship. Like the second I touch that thing, I just figured something out and it's been like the easiest decision to make. It's just like, well, like I want to make some ceramic thing or like draw something. I'm like, oh, like I want to see what that looks like built out. So it's just, I don't know. It's just, I'm like fortunate to have that kind of like clarity with like, just with like living in life.
Right. And I think that little bit of background is helpful for people to hear, that your entryway to ceramics was one that almost, to your words, felt like intuitive. And thank you, Nina, for putting this image on the screen because I heard also in another interview that you were working in a residency right before the pandemic hit and you were thinking about wishing wells. And this work on the screen, I think, is part of that train of thought. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is part of that train of thought. Like I wasn't thinking about wishing well specifically, but I was thinking about like, like this phrase hope omens, I wanted to like, I'm still trying to put out like sculptures that feel like more open and more hopeful where you could kind of like sit with it and yeah, just like hope or like wish for like a better time. I feel like I work with a lot of clocks in my work and I feel like that's all I'm trying to do with like the clocks in the work is like trying to like reconfigure or like just like have us take a moment of pause to kind of like think about how we're spending our time and what we want to be doing like moving forward. Like before, like all of the clocks that I made were fixed on 11:11. I don't know if you guys are like, there's like a whole
That's
phenomenon.
when you make a wish, is that right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, make a wish, but like, some people feel like it's a spiritual like doorway or it's like a sign of a good omen, and I'm very much of that kind of like crowd where I think like, yeah, it's like, why not? Whenever you get a chance to like stop and pause and think about like how you're living with intention. So, I mean, I feel like, yeah, this piece I made right before the pandemic and yeah, I don't know, it's just like some weird omen that I probably put out. Whereas like all of us are wishing for this time period to kind of like, transition to a different place.
And I've also seen, I'm glad you brought up the clocks, because I saw on your Instagram account just a few works, I think, that are out in California being exhibited or were recently exhibited that show clocks. One was called Wasting Time. And another one actually shows a clock with the digits all jumbled and fallen to the bottom of the clock. And so I think this idea of considering your time in a very conscious way, it speaks through in that. So thank you for bringing that up, because you beat me to my own question there. And there was something else that I was thinking about. There is definitely a tension in some of the works that are on view in the exhibition at Nina's space, where it seems like there's a psychological tension, and that the objects have an emotive quality that is fully human. And it's the secret, perhaps the secret life of objects when we're not around. Something I think about a lot. The brave little toaster, right? The cartoon that takes on its own life and has human adventures. And so I'm curious, when we're looking at these tensions and these psychological elements, there's also a tension in the media of ceramics itself. It's a fragile thing. Do you see a connection there, or is it something you think about?
Yeah. I feel like I was about to say something and I lost my train of thought. Tension, yeah, completely. Yeah, completely lost my object. Oh, that's what I was gonna say. I remember. Thank you for kind of like restarting my brain. So like the whole tension with the objects and kind of like, you know, them having like this emotive psychological quality. There was a moment in graduate school where I was just making strictly like figurative ceramic stuff, and like I was getting super bored with that conversation. I was getting frustrated because it wasn't like nuanced. And then I started to think about, there are different things that happened in my process that made me realize that the figure wasn't that important, like I didn't need it. And then I guess my questioning went from like, how do I explore, you know, these like psychological things like in figurative sculpture. It went from thinking about that to like thinking about what happens if the objects are imbued with the psychology that I was trying to get through with the figures. And then I started like just making like installations or objects that had that in mind, where the viewer could kind of start to act and do the work that I was trying to communicate with the figurative ceramics.
Interesting. And the seeing painting in this exhibition is also something that's new to me, as someone who was only familiar with your ceramics before this conversation happened. And I believe you were saying that the paintings did inform the grouping of work for this show. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. Like I felt like, you know, I feel like my relationship with ceramics is kind of like it's funny because like sometimes I have a lot of energy to do it, and then other times it's just like super physical. I kind of need to take some space back. So I felt like, yeah, I just started working on some paintings to kind of generate some things that I was like excited to make. And yeah, the painting and drawing has always been a part of like who I am as a person. So I'm glad that one, I'm more comfortable with like showing them, because before like I was not trying to show them. There's like something I do feel like super insecure about, but gaining more confidence with like putting them out.
Well, I see like similarities between, I mean, absolutely a dialogue between the paintings and the sculptures, particularly in the gestures. It's almost like if you were to look at the full figure, painted figure in this composition, I see a relationship between particularly that the two grouped vessels, not the one with the comb on top, but I definitely see an exchange there.
There's also like such a rich history, and like Beatrice Wood made phenomenal drawings and paintings that a lot of people never saw in her lifetime because she was doing it, you know, but even like Betty Woodman with the wall tapestries and the paintings that she made. I mean, I think that that's a dialogue that's constant, you know, and I think, you know, too, Woody, we've talked a lot, even with the lights. I mean, we haven't really like addressed these pieces, but I think it's important to understand that there is like a transitional space that you're addressing between the world that we occupy as figures and the world that your thoughts occupy as like the sort of carriers of these emotions and kind of hopes and burdens and all of that. And you're creating it in the 2 dimensions and the 3, and the functional objects, I think, serve as like such a nice bridge between those 2 worlds,
That's a really excellent way of like putting it. Like, that's providing me with more clarity now, that information. But yeah, like this object, or like this hanging light would not exist if I did not make the paintings with like these hanging light sources. So yeah, I mean, this is a perfect scenario of how like the paintings are directly informing like the objects that I'm making.
Yeah, I love that.
And I'm going to put out there for everyone that we'll probably be taking a last question here in just a moment. But I did want to bring up, just as a Florida girl, I can't help but bring the past up. And, I grew up here. You grew up here in Miami, Woody. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, just a little bit north. And I'm just curious if, growing up down here, we talked about it with identity a little bit earlier with Nina's questioning, but anything you'd like to share about that experience or how it informed what you were doing? I know you studied at FAU, go Owls. So just curious, if you could share anything more on that.
Yeah, that's something that I'm like still like thinking about. I feel like my entire practice, just like, the fact that it's primarily situated in the domestic, is like, I feel like I'm actively making sense of where home is, where place is, what that feels like, what that looks like, thinking about how that, like, just being in my body, what that kind of like means, given like the history of like this country. So it's not like out there, like just like super overtly, but I feel like, just like how loaded these like domestic spaces are, there's a lot of that like questioning and rumbling that's going on. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, there's no place like Miami. I feel so fortunate to have like, spent most of my life in South Florida, because it's helping me to kind of like approach the type of like social, like this, like the social conversation, like in a way that's like, I feel like, at least for me, I think it's like nuanced. I feel like it's complex,
Absolutely. I think the Florida stereotype is something that irks me endlessly. And I think there is a lot more complexity to the people from South Florida than the rest of the nation perhaps gives us credit for.
Yeah.
So I always ask that question when I hear someone else is also from South Florida, see if that also bothers them as well. But Nina, Woody, tremendous thanks for hosting this conversation tonight, and perhaps introducing our audience to your work, Woody, or reintroducing. And Nina, thank you for just making this dialogue possible.
Of course. Thank you all for having us. Thank you, Woody, for taking time out of your afternoon, and especially Rachel for your thoughtful questions. I really appreciate that. We were saying everyone gets shy on the Zoom, and wait, do I see something in the chat? Oh yeah, just a thank you. Thank you, Ezra. But we're so honored to be doing this with the Norton, and the show is up until January 30th. So if anyone wants to come by, we're closed from the 23rd to the 5th, whatever that Tuesday is. But we're now open to the public Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 5. We just ask you wear masks when you come, practice social distancing, and yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it and stay safe through this holiday season.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much, Woody. So appreciative.
And if people want to follow you online, Nina, Woody, would you mind giving us your Instagram handles just so people can find you?
Yeah, the gallery on Instagram is just Nina Johnson Gallery. And Woody, I think yours is just Woody De Othello, right?
No, it's Woody Othello.
Woody Othello.
Yeah.
Beautiful. It's good feeds out there. So if you're so inclined, I'd give them a follow. Big thumbs up.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Peace, everybody.